Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
I met Nate on a Sunday in early March, the kind of day where the rain feels like it's falling in slow motion and everything smells like wet concrete and coffee. I was in line at Powell's Books, holding a copy of some vintage interior design magazine and a half-finished latte, when the guy behind me tapped my shoulder and said, "I was gonna get that exact one." His smile was disarming, kind of lazy and crooked, like he didn't take himself too seriously. He had this quiet, bookish energy, brown hair with a stubborn curl, navy peacoat, and a voice just a notch above a whisper. Before I knew it, we were having coffee, then walking, then dinner, and suddenly I was texting my sister like, this guy might be something. At first, he really was everything I thought I wanted. Not flashy, not overbearing, just kind. He asked questions. He actually listened to my answers. We'd sit in his kitchen making breakfast, and he'd steal my avocado toast and tell me he liked how my laugh sounded like I was trying not to laugh. It was easy, peaceful, there wasn't a spark. There was a calm. After years of dating men who were all fireworks and follow-up apologies, this felt like a long exhale. By week 3, we were seeing each other almost every day. That's when he invited me to meet his family for dinner. I didn't even hesitate. It felt soon, sure, but Nate was the kind of guy who made everything feel like it belonged. I remember fussing over my outfit more than usual, not because I wanted to impress, but because for the first time in a long time, I actually cared what someone's family thought of me. I wanted them to like me because I was already picturing Thanksgivings and Sunday brunches and summer barbecues with these people. At that point, I was all in. Dinner was at his mom's house, a big colonial-style place just outside Beaverton, decorated like a Hobby Lobby exploded inside a Pinterest board. Lots of shiplap, scripted wall art, and one of those signs that said, "Bless this mess," above the kitchen doorway. His mom, Linda, greeted me with a polite but firm handshake instead of a hug, and immediately asked if I wanted something to drink besides wine. I laughed nervously and said wine was fine. She didn't laugh back. His sister Jenna was already 3 glasses in and immediately complimented my shoes in that way, where it's not a compliment. I've never seen anyone wear heels with jeans. That's so brave. Nate chuckled like it was cute, and I brushed it off. First impressions can be weird. Maybe they were just tight-knit, protective. Maybe I was reading into it too much. But then came the dinner questions. What did I do? Graphic design. Did I work freelance? Yes, mostly. Was that stable enough? Well, it depends. Did my parents help me out? Not since I was 20. Linda nodded slowly, sipping her Chardonnay with the kind of face that says everything without needing to speak. Jenna chimed in to say her husband just got promoted and that stability was underrated these days, especially in this economy. I laughed politely, trying to keep it light, but something about the way Nate just stared down at his plate made me feel like maybe this wasn't a one-time thing. Still, I went home telling myself it had just been nerves. Maybe I had walked in with too many expectations. People have off nights. Families are weird. They don't always roll out the red carpet, right? I remember texting Nate to say thank you for dinner and that his mom's chicken piccata was delicious. He just replied, "Glad you survived," followed by a winking emoji. I told myself it was just a joke. A weird, slightly uncomfortable joke, but still a joke. The weeks went on, and things between us got deeper. We took weekend trips to the coast, fell asleep watching documentaries, started casually using words like someday and ours. But each time I saw his family, there was this quiet resistance from them. Like no matter how sweet I was, how hard I tried to engage, there was an invisible gate I wasn't allowed through. His mom never asked about my family, never seemed interested in anything I said unless it was about Nate. Jenna always found a way to make backhanded comments sound like compliments, and I started to dread every time I heard her voice. I told Nate once, after a brunch where Linda called me spirited and Jenna made a joke about my Portland liberal energy, that I didn't think they liked me very much. He frowned and said, "That's just how they are. Don't take it personally. They give everyone crap at first." Then he kissed me on the forehead and turned up the TV. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think it was just hazing, a little pushback before the acceptance kicked in. After all, it's not like they were throwing stones. They were just cold, passive. Not outwardly cruel, just quietly judgmental in a way that made me constantly question whether I was being dramatic or just perceptive. But it wasn't just one dinner. It became a pattern, a tone, 1,000 little paper cuts, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together forming something raw and undeniable. And the worst part? Nate never really saw it. Or if he did, he never said anything. I started paying attention to the silences, the moments when I'd glance at him after one of Linda's comments, hoping for a laugh or a raised eyebrow, or even a simple, "Hey, knock it off." And instead I'd get nothing, just a soft smile, or a sip of his drink, or a subject change. At first I told myself that this was just a test, that some families take time to warm up. But something about this didn't feel like warming up. It felt like slow erosion, and I think the worst part was how much I wanted them to like me. How I kept adjusting, shrinking, softening the edges of who I was, just to make it easier for them to accept me. I started changing things without even realizing it. Laughing a little quieter, dressing a little more neutral, holding my tongue a little more often. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would take me almost a year to name out loud. And by the time I did, it would already be too late to pretend I hadn't seen the signs. Because the truth was, they were always there. I just didn't want to believe them. I think the hardest part about slow, subtle disrespect is that it's never loud enough for someone else to hear. It's like being poked over and over in the same spot. Just enough to sting, not enough to bruise, but after a while, you start flinching before the next one even lands. That's what being around Nate's family started to feel like. It wasn't an outright rejection, but it was something that lived in the air, like tension right before a storm. Only no one else could feel it but me. It started showing up in the smallest ways, the kinds of things that are hard to explain without sounding petty. Linda would invite us over for dinner and always forget I was vegetarian, then laugh when I'd say no to the pork roast, offering a microwaved side dish like it was a thoughtful compromise. Jenna would tag everyone in group photos and just not tag me, even when I was in them. Or she'd crop me out entirely, then post it with a caption like the OGs. There were always jokes, too, about my hipster coffee order, about my reusable grocery bags, about how I probably had a compost pile in my yard. One time she called me Portland Haley in a baby voice, like I was some cartoon character they were forced to tolerate. Nate heard all of it, and most of the time, he just laughed, or rolled his eyes and mumbled something like, "That's just Jenna." He never really challenged them. He never asked them to stop. He said I was being too sensitive. And at first, I believed him, because it's easy to believe the person you love. It's easy to gaslight yourself into thinking it's not a big deal when everyone else is acting like it's harmless. But it never felt harmless. It felt calculated, like a performance, with me as the outsider who wasn't supposed to notice she'd been cast as the punchline. One night, we were at Nate's mom's house for his father's birthday dinner. I brought a bottle of wine I'd picked up from a local winery, something I knew Nate's dad liked. And when I handed it to Linda at the door, she looked at the label and said, "Oh, this is that earthy stuff. Well, maybe someone will want it." She set it on the counter like it was expired milk. Nate just laughed and kissed my cheek, like it was all cute and unimportant. I stood there smiling tightly, already regretting the effort. But I said nothing, again. That night, Jenna told a story at the dinner table about one of Nate's exes, a girl named Michelle, who apparently used to make these perfect lemon tarts every Christmas. "We all thought he was going to marry her," she said, looking right at me. "Didn't we, Mom?" Linda didn't even look up from her plate. "She had a steady job at the hospital," she added, almost absent-mindedly. "Very practical." I don't even remember what I said. Probably nothing. Because when people say things like that, there's no good comeback that doesn't make you look crazy. After that dinner, in the car, I finally cracked a little. I asked Nate why they always talked about Michelle when I was around. why Jenna seemed determined to remind me I wasn't part of the family yet. He sighed and said I was imagining things. "It's not like they're mean to you," he said. "They're just old school." Then he told me again that I needed to lighten up, that I was always looking for something to be offended by. I stared out the window, blinking fast so I wouldn't cry. Because that's what it had come to, me silencing myself to keep the peace, even when I was the one being made to feel like a stranger in my own relationship. I started writing things down in my phone, not to make a list, but to remind myself that it wasn't all in my head. I logged moments, word for word, the time Linda said my tattoo was distracting, the time Jenna laughed when I said I didn't want kids right away, the time Nate's cousin asked if I was really a designer or just like someone who plays around with fonts. I wasn't being dramatic. I was just finally paying attention, and the worst part was that none of this happened when we were alone. Nate was perfect when it was just us. He listened, made dinner, lit candles, rubbed my shoulders when I was tired. He talked about the future, about houses and road trips and what we'd name our dog someday. He told me he loved me, and I believed him because I wanted to, because when someone gives you softness in private and silence in public, it confuses you. You start thinking maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe you're the problem. But I knew something was off. I felt it in the pit of my stomach every time we got invited to a family thing. I started dreading holidays, which used to be my favorite time of year. I'd stare at my closet trying to pick an outfit that wouldn't spark another round of subtle digs. Too trendy, too frumpy, too try-hard, too casual, somehow always wrong. I started keeping a spare jacket in the car, just in case I needed to cover up something they'd mock. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, I told my best friend Nina everything. She was the first person I trusted with the truth. Not the watered-down version, but all of it. She listened quietly, her eyes narrowing more with each detail. When I finished, she didn't try to comfort me. She just said, "They don't respect you, and he's letting them get away with it." That hit harder than I expected, because somewhere deep down, I already knew it. I just hadn't wanted to say it out loud, because if I said it out loud, then I had to do something about it. I kept waiting for things to change. For Nate to wake up and say, "Hey, you're right, they're out of line." But that moment never came. And with every family dinner, every wine night with Jenna, every polite but cutting comment from Linda, I felt myself shrinking a little more. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't just losing patience. I was losing pieces of myself, quietly, gradually, like someone slowly dimming the lights in a room you used to love sitting in. And before long, I would barely recognize the woman who once walked into that family's house, hopeful and open, and still believing she could be accepted just as she was. It was Christmas Eve when I started to question if the quiet hostility I'd been experiencing was something I could ever really live with, or if I was just slowly becoming numb to it out of necessity. Nate and I had been together for nearly 9 months by that point, and despite everything that had happened, the little jabs, the offhand remarks, the casual dismissals, I was still holding on to the hope that things would settle down eventually. I kept telling myself that the holidays might soften his family, that the warmth of the season might make people behave better, or maybe even give them a reason to connect with me as a human being, instead of as an outsider with questionable career stability and the audacity to have an opinion. That hope, as naive as it was, kept me optimistic enough to say yes when Nate asked if I'd spend Christmas with his family instead of flying back to see mine. It wasn't a small decision. It meant missing my family's annual tamale-making night, my dad's terrible Santa hat, and my sister's Christmas morning coffee with too much Baileys. But I wanted to be a part of Nate's world, and I thought maybe this was how you did it, by showing up even when it was uncomfortable, by proving that you were serious, that you were all in. The house was decorated like a magazine spread. Linda had gone all out. Garland on every doorway, red and gold ribbons, a perfectly symmetrical tree covered in matching ornaments, and a scent of cinnamon and pine that probably came from some 3-wick candle with a name like Yule Forest. Everyone was dressed up just enough to feel formal, but casual enough to pretend it was relaxed. I'd brought a carefully wrapped bottle of small batch whiskey for Nate's dad, and a box of handmade soaps for Linda. both of which she accepted with a tight smile and a quick, distracted thank you, before setting them aside like she was cataloging unwanted clutter. Jenna greeted me with her usual air kiss and a comment about how my hair looked so different this time, followed by a vague, "I liked it better before, but this is fun too." I laughed, but it didn't reach my eyes. Dinner was a minefield of small talk, carefully veiled comparisons, and conversations that seemed to bend around me instead of including me. Nate sat next to me, holding my hand under the table like that made it better, like I couldn't feel the cold wall forming between me and the rest of the room. At one point, Linda asked Jenna about her latest baking class, and Jenna launched into a long story about the lemon tarts she had perfected. Nate's dad, halfway into his second glass of wine, interrupted to say that Michelle used to make the best lemon desserts, and how they'd never tasted anything like hers since. Everyone smiled and nodded, as if they were reliving a fond memory, completely oblivious to the way my stomach turned at the mention of his ex. I glanced at Nate, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just kept chewing his food, eyes fixed on his plate like he was trying to disappear into it. After dinner, we moved to the living room for gifts. I handed out mine with genuine excitement. I'd spent weeks picking thoughtful, personal things for each of them, hoping to earn at least a sliver of warmth in return. Linda unwrapped hers, a delicate silver picture frame with an old photo of Nate and her that I'd had printed and resized, then said, "Oh, how sentimental," in a tone that made it sound like I'd gifted her a sock. She passed it to the side table without another word. Jenna opened the scarf I'd knit her and said, "You made this? I guess homemade's back in style now." I didn't even respond. I just smiled and turned to Nate's present from his mom, curious to see what she'd gotten him. She handed him a box with a big red bow. He opened it slowly, and inside was a set of vintage cufflinks and a card. When he read the card, he froze for a moment, then looked up at Linda with a weird expression I couldn't quite read. I leaned over and asked what it said. He shook his head and said it was nothing, just a little family joke. I let it go, but later, after most people had gone to bed or wandered off into other parts of the house, I found the card in the trash. It read, "May these bring you better luck next time." I stared at it for a long time before putting it back exactly where I'd found it. That was the first time I wondered if Linda actually wanted this relationship to fail. If she saw me as some kind of lesson rather than a person Nate loved. Later that night, I was sitting on the back porch alone, sipping mulled wine and staring at the icy backyard, when Jenna came out and plopped down beside me. She was tipsy, maybe a little more than tipsy, and had that look on her face that people get right before they say something that's been bubbling up for a while. She lit a cigarette, something she only did when she was trying to look casual, and asked me, out of nowhere, "Are you sure you're the one?" I turned toward her, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, blowing smoke into the cold night air. "I mean, like, you and Nate? It's a lot. He's different when he's with you. Quieter, like he's trying really hard to keep the peace, you know?" I blinked, unsure how to respond. She kept going. "We all just thought back when he was with Michelle that he was more himself, more alive. With you, it's like he's constantly managing things. I'm not trying to be a bitch. People change when it's right, but they shouldn't shrink." I didn't answer her. I just sat there, watching the steam rise from my cup, listening to the echo of her words. Because the truth was I'd had that same thought about myself. I had changed, and not in the way you change when you grow. I had shrunk too. I had bent myself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into a mold I hadn't realized was designed to reject me. A week later, Nate proposed. It was on New Year's Eve, in front of a crowd at a party his parents were hosting. Flashy, loud, completely performative. I said yes, mostly because I felt like I had to. Like saying no in front of all those people would be cruel. He kissed me, the room cheered, and Linda clapped with a smile so thin it might have cracked under pressure. Later that night, when we were alone, I cried into his shoulder, overwhelmed and confused, and all he said was, "We'll be okay. They'll come around." But something in me had already shifted. Because when someone asks if you're sure you're the one and you don't know how to answer, maybe that's the answer. And maybe the scariest part isn't that they don't love you, it's that you've started wondering if they ever could. The first time I realized I had stopped making decisions about my own wedding was when I found myself sitting silently in the middle of Linda's dining room, nodding along while she and Jenna debated the floral arrangements as if I wasn't even there. They weren't arguing, they were collaborating, tossing around words like timeless and elegant, both of which apparently were incompatible with anything I had chosen. My original idea for wildflower bouquets was met with tight smiles and phrases like, a bit too rustic, and might clash with the linens. I had imagined a wedding filled with color and softness, and a little bit of chaos, the good kind, the kind that feels like real life. But instead, I watched as my future mother-in-law passed around swatches of ivory satin and gold-rimmed dinnerware, and I nodded because I couldn't bring myself to fight anymore. Somewhere along the way, the planning had stopped being ours and had become hers. Nate didn't notice, or maybe he just didn't care. Every time I tried to bring something up, a song I didn't want played, a friend I wanted included, an element I felt strongly about, he'd respond with something like, "It's just one day," or "It makes her happy, just let her have this," as though my discomfort was a small price to pay for Linda's peace of mind. But it wasn't just one day. It was my wedding, and little by little, I felt it slipping further and further out of my hands. I started waking up in the middle of the night, restless, sweaty, unable to shake the growing sense that I was being swallowed whole. I'd lie there next to Nate, listening to his even breathing, and wonder how someone could sleep so soundly while I was unraveling inch by inch. My chest would tighten with the weight of words I hadn't said during the day, and I'd lie there with them lodged in my throat like stones. Eventually, I started keeping my phone under my pillow, and when I couldn't sleep, I'd open the Notes app and type everything I didn't have the courage to say out loud. At first, it was just a few thoughts, a line here, a line there. But one night, after a particularly humiliating afternoon with Linda and Jenna at a bridal boutique, where they insisted I try on dresses that made me feel like a stranger in my own body, I opened a new note and wrote 2 words in bold. The list. I didn't plan to show it to anyone. It was just for me. A place to keep track of the things I was no longer willing to pretend were okay. The first item was simple. I didn't pick the venue. That had been decided the moment Linda mentioned her friend's vineyard estate in the Willamette Valley, a place I had never even seen in person. I had wanted something small, maybe even a courthouse wedding followed by a backyard reception with fairy lights and food trucks. Something intimate and ours. But Linda had made it clear, in her usual passive-aggressive way, that this family doesn't do casual weddings. The second item. Nate didn't defend me when Jenna joked about my dad's job. We were at a Sunday brunch, and somehow the topic of my family came up. When I mentioned that my father worked in pest control, Jenna had laughed and said, "So that's why you're not afraid to speak up, used to handling rats." Nate had laughed too, not maliciously, but enough to let the moment slide. I smiled through it, like I always did, and pretended it didn't sting. The list grew quickly after that. They changed the caterer without asking me. Linda told her friend I was just a freelancer. Jenna said I'd age well if I kept my weight in check. Nate hasn't said I've got your back once. Each entry was like a small cut, and reading them all together made me realize just how many I had accumulated. When you experience something painful in isolation, it's easy to rationalize it away. But when you put them side by side, they start to form a pattern that's impossible to ignore. I shared the list with Nina one afternoon over coffee. She read it slowly, then looked up at me with the kind of expression people get when they want to say something harsh but kind. She asked me, gently but firmly, if I was really going to go through with it. At first, I didn't answer. I just stared at my cup, fingers wrapped around it like it was keeping me from floating away. Eventually, I whispered, "I think I've already lost myself. I just haven't figured out how to say it out loud." She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "You haven't lost anything. You're still here. You're just buried under all their noise." That night, I sat in bed next to Nate, and I asked him the kind of question you can't walk back from. I asked him if he thought we were planning our wedding, or if we were just trying to survive it. He looked confused at first, then annoyed, then tired. He said I was overthinking again, and that everything was going to be fine, and that weddings were stressful for everyone. He kissed me and rolled over, and just like that, the moment passed. But for me, it didn't. It hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Because the truth is, I wasn't just overthinking. I was finally thinking. I was finally seeing the space between who I had imagined we'd be and who we actually were. I was starting to realize that love, by itself, doesn't always translate to partnership. That sometimes the person you love the most can be the same person who allows you to be hurt. Just because standing up for you would require too much effort. And maybe the most painful realization of all was that I didn't miss the girl who had said yes to the proposal. I missed the version of myself who would have walked away at the first sign of disrespect. I missed the version of myself who hadn't learned to be silent in exchange for harmony. The list stayed in my phone, growing longer with each passing week. And though I didn't know it yet, it would become the thing that saved me in the end. Not because it told me what to do, but because it reminded me of everything I had already endured, and how far I drifted from the woman I used to be. The night of the engagement party felt like walking into a stage play where everyone had memorized their lines except me. I had spent the morning pacing my apartment, going over what I would say if someone asked about the wedding plans, the honeymoon, or anything else I was supposed to be excited about but had started to feel suffocated by. I curled my hair and did my makeup with a mechanical kind of precision. The kind that comes from trying to hold it together when your mind is spinning and your gut is telling you to run. The dress I wore was one Linda had picked out, an off-white chiffon number with lace at the sleeves that I never would have chosen for myself. When I first tried it on, I had said it felt too delicate, too bridal for an engagement party. Linda had tilted her head and said, "Well, you are about to be a bride, aren't you? Might as well start dressing like one." And I, once again, had said nothing. The venue is a rented banquet hall in a trendy part of downtown, filled with Edison bulbs, minimalist centerpieces, and more white tablecloths than I cared to count. Everything looked beautiful in a soulless, overstyled kind of way. Nate had let his mom and sister plan nearly all of it, claiming he didn't care about the details and that he just wanted everyone to have a good time. He told me that morning he was proud of us, that not every couple made it this far, that all the noise would fade after the wedding. I nodded, smiled, and kissed him back, but I was no longer sure that I wanted to make it through the noise, because the more time passed, the more I felt like I wasn't surviving the planning. I was disappearing in it. People started arriving in waves. Nate's coworkers, family, friends, distant relatives I'd never met and would probably never see again after this night. I stood beside Nate and smiled for photos, shook hands, accepted compliments on my ring, and laughed when people asked about our love story, like it hadn't started with hope and slowly transformed into negotiation. Nina showed up late, slipped through the crowd, and gave me a look that said she was watching everything with both eyes open. I was relieved she was there because by then, I had stopped trusting myself to tell the difference between my own overreactions and the very real disapproval radiating off Nate's mother like perfume. At one point, Linda took the mic to make a toast. She wore a silver dress that sparkled under the lights, and her voice had that crisp, practiced tone people use when they've been rehearsing their charm for years. She talked about how happy the family was to welcome me, how excited they were for the wedding, and how marriage is a test of patience, humor, and commitment. Not everyone is built for it, but when you find the right match, you just know. People clapped politely. I sipped my champagne and kept my eyes locked on the bubbles. Then Jenna leaned over, laughing in that too loud way she always did when she wanted people to notice, and said to Linda, just loud enough for me and the few people around us to hear, "We'll see how long this one lasts." And Linda, without missing a beat, laughed with her. Not a little giggle, but a full, genuine laugh, like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all night. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it clarified. It was like watching the final piece of a puzzle snap into place. I looked at Nate, expecting, no, begging, for a reaction, a glance, a furrowed brow, a word, anything to show me that he heard it and that it wasn't okay. But he just sipped his drink, eyes darting elsewhere, as if pretending he didn't hear would somehow erase what had been said. He looked peaceful, detached, like a man who had long since decided that silence was easier than confrontation. I put my glass down and stood up slowly, with a calm that felt foreign, like it wasn't even mine. I walked toward the front of the room, weaving between tables, heels echoing across the floor. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, could hear whispers start to rise and die mid-sentence. I reached for the microphone, gently took it from the man holding it, and turned toward the crowd. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I looked out at the sea of people, smiling, sipping, waiting to be entertained, and I said, "Thank you all for coming. I know this was supposed to be a celebration, but I think it's time to be honest." There was a rustle of movement, a clearing of throats. Nate stood up slightly confused, maybe even embarrassed. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the space between the tables and the exits, on the walls I had let close in around me for the last year. I've been trying very hard to fit into something that was never meant for me. I thought I could make it work, that if I kept showing up, kept smiling, kept being polite, eventually I'd be accepted. But tonight, something became very clear to me. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if the people around me are laughing with me or at me. Someone gasped. A chair scraped. I didn't stop. I've decided not to marry into this family. The silence that followed was like a wave crashing in reverse, pulling the air out of the room and leaving nothing but a vacuum where laughter had once echoed. No one moved. Nate stood frozen beside his chair. Jenna blinked, stunned. Linda's face twisted into something between confusion and fury. Nina, in the corner, didn't move a muscle. I set the microphone down gently and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for Nate to follow. I didn't check my phone or glance at the stairs boring into my back. The truth is, I had already left long before I walked out of that room. That moment at the microphone was just the first time I let everyone else see it. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. I stood on the curb, wrapped in silence, and let myself feel everything: grief, freedom, fear, and a strange sense of peace I hadn't known in months. My engagement was over. My relationship was collapsing behind me. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't pretending to be okay. What none of them knew, what maybe even I hadn't known until that very moment, was that I hadn't come to that party to celebrate. I had come to say goodbye. The night after the engagement party, I didn't sleep. I lay on the couch of Nina's apartment, still wearing the dress I had walked out in, makeup smudged at the corners of my eyes and my heels sitting silently on the floor by the door, like two little witnesses to everything that had happened. Nina had driven me home from the venue in complete silence, not out of awkwardness, but because she understood that sometimes silence is the only thing you can offer someone who's just detonated her life. She handed me a blanket, made me tea, and didn't ask a single question. That alone made me cry harder than I had the entire night. There's something so painful about being seen clearly after so many months of pretending you were fine. My phone buzzed nonstop in the early hours. Missed calls from Nate, a few texts from people I barely knew, people who had been at the party, all of them trying to wrap their heads around what they'd just witnessed. A couple of them offered thin reassurances. Things like, "You seemed really brave up there," or "That was intense, but maybe necessary." I couldn't bring myself to respond. I turned the phone over and stared at the ceiling, my mind playing the moment over and over again, like a movie I couldn't stop watching. The click of the microphone, the weight of the room, Nate's stunned face, Linda's frozen smirk, The pin drop silence after my words landed. It was all burned into my memory like a brand. Sometime around dawn, I got up and stood in Nina's bathroom, staring at my reflection like I was trying to recognize someone I used to be. My face looked older, not tired, aged. There was a hollowness around my eyes that hadn't been there the year before. I wiped off the remaining makeup with a washcloth and whispered, "It's over," to the empty room, like I needed to say it out loud to believe it. Not just the engagement, but the pretending, the shrinking, the endless reaching for something that had never reached back. Later that morning, Nate finally sent a text that wasn't just "please call me." It was a long paragraph, measured and diplomatic, that read more like a press release than anything heartfelt. He said he was shocked and hurt, that he wished I had talked to him privately before doing something so public, that he still loved me but didn't understand why I had to make a scene. He didn't ask why I did it. He didn't apologize. He just wanted damage control. And for the first time, reading his words, I didn't feel guilt. I felt relief. There's a specific moment when you realize the person you've been fighting to keep wouldn't have fought for you. That clarity, painful as it is, comes like a wave, and it pulls everything else with it. All the small things I had brushed aside, all the compromises, all the moments I had justified, all the excuses I had made, they rose to the surface, undeniable and loud. I read his message twice, then deleted it without responding. For the next few days, I stayed at Nina's place. She cooked for me, let me talk when I needed to, and stay quiet when I didn't. She canceled plans to keep me company and kept her voice low and calm, like she knew I was walking a tightrope of emotion that could snap at any moment. My parents called, confused but supportive. My sister flew in from Denver for a weekend just to sit on the couch and rub my back while we watched bad reality TV, and even though everything still hurt, I started to feel the fog lift, like the weight of what I had been carrying had finally been set down somewhere. I didn't need to pick it back up from. But it wasn't all clarity and courage. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I stared at the ring still sitting in my purse and wondered if I had been too impulsive, too dramatic, too stubborn. There were hours when I replayed Nate's voice in my head, the quiet affection in it, and asked myself if I had walked away from something that might have still been salvageable. Because the truth is, walking away isn't always accompanied by a sense of triumph. Sometimes it feels like grief. Sometimes it feels like ripping something out of your chest that you spent years building a home for. And yet, underneath all that doubt, there was a quiet, growing certainty, a sense that I had finally done the thing I had been too afraid to do for too long, that I had stopped waiting for someone else to save me from a life I didn't want, and had saved myself instead. A few days later, Nate sent me one final message. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. He said he respected my decision, but wished I had handled it like an adult. He said I embarrassed him and his family, and that he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive me. Then he signed off with, "I guess this is goodbye." I stared at the screen for a long time before turning the phone off and putting it in a drawer, because I didn't need closure from someone who had watched me sink and offered no hand. Instead, I opened my notes app again and scrolled through the list. I read each item slowly, letting the weight of every moment settle in again. The forgotten details, the constant minimizing, the erosion of my self-worth. I had documented it all, and now I saw it with new eyes. It wasn't just a list anymore. It was evidence, not for anyone else, but for me. Proof that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't too sensitive, that I hadn't destroyed something good. I had escaped something soul-crushing. In the end, the speech wasn't about humiliating anyone. It wasn't about revenge or attention or spectacle. It was the only way I could make them hear me after months of being drowned out. It was the only way to stop a wedding that had stopped being mine. It was a declaration, not of war, but of freedom. And as I sat in Nina's apartment that night, sipping tea in my pajamas with the TV flickering in the background and my heart finally beating at its own pace, I knew that while it wasn't the ending I had pictured, it was the one I had needed. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't holding on. It's letting go with your whole chest and saying, actually, I've decided not to. In the weeks that followed the engagement party, I came to understand that grief does not only follow death, but also the conscious choice to abandon a future you once built your entire world around. It wasn't just about losing Nate, or his family, or the life I had imagined for myself that included crisp autumn weddings and framed photos on a mantle and holidays with too much wine and too many inside jokes. It was about letting go of the version of myself that had fought so hard to make it work, the woman who had swallowed her voice one too many times in the hope that eventually it would be safe to speak freely. What I felt in those first few weeks was a mix of devastation and deep, echoing peace, a confusing cocktail of sorrow and liberation that sat heavy in my chest. No matter what I was doing, whether I was walking through the aisles of a grocery store or staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, wondering if I had made the right decision, some people responded to my decision with cautious support, the kind that comes with wide eyes and hesitant words, as if they were impressed by my courage, but also a little afraid of what it meant. Others were not so subtle with their disapproval. A few of Nate's friends unfollowed me on social media within days, and one even sent me a message to say he hoped I found whatever it was I was looking for. That phrase stuck with me, whatever it was, as if I had been some restless woman chasing a ghost, unable to appreciate the perfectly adequate life I had been handed, as if dignity, peace of mind, and mutual respect were vague, irrational things to want. I didn't respond to him. There was nothing to say to someone who thought leaving a man who wouldn't defend you was a sign of being ungrateful. What hurt more, though, was the silence. The people who said nothing, friends who I had gone to dinner with, celebrated birthdays with, shared dreams and disappointments with, suddenly quiet. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of discomfort. Because I had done the unthinkable. I had rejected the story we were all told to want. I had stepped off the path, and in doing so, reminded them that the path is not the only way. And for some people, that is terrifying. I moved out of the apartment Nate and I had shared, and into a small one-bedroom unit in Seattle, a city I had always loved visiting but never had the nerve to live in. It wasn't a dramatic move across the country, but it was far enough away to feel new, to reset, to breathe. The place had creaky floors and mismatched fixtures, but it was mine. No one else picked out the throw pillows or told me which art looked too loud. I lit candles that smelled like sandalwood and pine, played records while cooking dinner, and stayed up reading until 2 a.m. without apologizing for taking up space. I started therapy again, this time not just to heal, but to rebuild. To stop asking why I hadn't been loved the way I needed, and instead ask why I had stayed so long in a place where I had to beg for it. That kind of work isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with applause or instant clarity. It's slow and ugly and filled with days where you question everything all over again. But there were also moments of sharp, beautiful recognition. Those small, quiet wins where you remember who you were before you started cutting pieces of yourself off to make someone else comfortable. Nina came to visit a few times, and each time we sat on the floor with wine and takeout, laughing like we had when we were 23, and still thought life came with clear answers and good timing. She told me that watching me walk away had changed something in her, that she had ended her situationship with the guy who always had an excuse and never a plan. "You reminded me that we don't have to wait for permission," she said. That sentence sat in my chest for days. Nate never reached out again. Not after the last message. Not after I moved. Not even when mutual friends mentioned my name. I heard through one of them that he had started seeing someone else a few months later. Someone from his office, someone sweet and uncomplicated. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I wanted him back, but because of the word uncomplicated. As if what had happened between us had been a mess I had created, a storm I had insisted on dragging into an otherwise peaceful sky. It made me wonder how many times women like me are cast as difficult simply for refusing to live quietly in discomfort. I started writing again. Not just journaling, but actual essays. Thoughts about identity, autonomy, silence, and the way women are taught to be grateful for any kind of attention, even when it's sharp-edged and conditional. I wrote about how freedom is expensive, not in money, but in relationships, in comfort, in the illusions we have to shatter to get there. I didn't publish anything. I just let myself say the things I had kept buried for too long. There's a kind of mourning that comes when you choose yourself over a life you thought you were supposed to want. It doesn't look like heartbreak, not at first. It looks like space, like mornings where your bed feels too big, like weekends without plans, like the quiet walk home from the grocery store where you realize no one is waiting for you. And slowly, that space becomes less of a wound and more of an invitation. I don't know what Nate tells people now when they ask about what happened between us. Maybe he says we grew apart. Maybe he blames the stress of the wedding or my supposed moodiness. Maybe he doesn't talk about it at all. I used to worry about that, about how I'd be remembered, about how the story would be retold without me in it. But now I understand that it doesn't matter, because the version that counts is the one I carry with me, the one where I stopped begging to be chosen and chose myself instead. Sometimes, when I walk through my new neighborhood, past the coffee shops and the bookstores and the little wine bars that don't know my history, I think about that night, the mic in my hand, the room holding its breath, the sound of my own voice finally speaking without permission. I don't remember what I looked like. I remember how I felt. Not angry, not scared, just done. And the truth is, I never needed them to applaud. I never needed Nate to chase me or Linda to change or Jenna to approve. I just needed to hear my own voice out loud, to say, once and for all, that I was no longer willing to shrink in the name of love. Maybe one day, someone will hear this story and see themselves in it. Maybe they'll be sitting at a dinner table, smiling politely while being slowly erased, and something will click. Maybe they'll realize that no amount of love is worth trading your self-respect. Maybe they'll walk away too. Or maybe they won't. But they'll know it's possible. And maybe that's enough. Because freedom costs something, but pretending costs more.